Welcome to the Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast. I'm Brandon Jaffe. Join us as we explore relationship and mental health issues by weeding out the trends in the mental health industry to uncover what truly works in improving our emotional well-being and relationships. At Inspired Resolutions Counseling, we specialize in providing interventions and resources for families with teens, focusing on topics such as teen mental health, parenting challenges, and family dynamics.
In this podcast, I am going to attempt to tackle the diagnosis of ADHD. And I become weary. I don't enjoy having conversations with people outside of the psychological field or professionals in the psychological field about this diagnosis because it has become such a huge phenomenon. It's one of these diagnoses that is being overdiagnosed for sure, which includes overprescribing medication that treats ADHD. It's become this huge debate even about whether the diagnosis exists or not. And I get the difficulty behind accurately diagnosing. I get the over-identifying with the diagnosis. And I think that this conversation is something that professionals need to be more honest about. Well, first of all, professionals who haven't dedicated themselves to truly understanding ADHD should be honest about whether or not they should treat it. And that leads me to another interesting phenomenon, and that is that we have specific ADHD coaches being hired, making a lot of money with no degree, no proof that they've dedicated themselves to understanding and treating this diagnosis. And that kind of falls into my whole coaching issues as a whole. While I can admit that I have run into people who are coaches for ADHD who are doing a good job, at the end of the day, they do not have any accountability. They are not accountable to a board. They're not accountable to a set of ethics. And that always worries me when somebody is treating any mental health issue. I also have an issue with people who have their degrees and haven't done their due diligence in being able to treat and in being learned in treating specific diagnoses or issues that they are treating, right? So if you are going to get the degree, you have a duty. You have a duty to keep your continuing education going, and you have a duty to get your experience and continuing your experience and not just shooting from the hip, doing what you think is good, but treating in alignment with the studies and the information that is accurate and is coming from the scientific method. I want to move on from that because I could talk all day about that. And I want to get into ADHD. This whole debate as to whether or not it exists is important for me to address. And it does exist. It's just that these symptoms are something that in some way, shape, or form, most, if not everybody, has experienced, like inattention. We live in a world where focus is becoming more and more difficult for people. We live in a world where distractions are everywhere, and the human condition is that it is hard to pay attention when you are not interested. And that is really an important piece. If you struggle to pay attention to the things that are boring to you, but you are able to pay attention to a handful of other things, you're probably not ADHD, you're just a human. You are somebody who has to wire your brain, so to speak, even though there are connotations in that wording. You are somebody who has to train yourself to be able to pay attention. And that means doing difficult tasks over and over again, learning to pay attention. And you can go your whole life avoiding those difficult tasks and look like somebody who has ADHD, but in fact, you don't have ADHD. And ADHD has to do with a specific way that your brain fires under certain conditions. And I'm not going to get into that today on this episode. I will in the future. But when you diagnose ADHD, first of all, you have to meet a certain requirement. Criteria has to be met and it must be pervasive. So all these symptoms that you hear about, it's not just, oh, wow, I identify with that a lot of the time, and it becomes really inconvenient for me because it makes it hard to pay attention in school, or it made it hard for me to sit through that boring lecture that was important for my work. And the symptoms don't magically disappear. They are pervasive. Just because you have difficulty paying attention in one context of your life, but in other contexts you're okay, doesn't mean that you have ADHD. Here's this kind of loophole that professionals and people have used to kind of justify, I have ADHD even though I can pay attention over here. And there's this hyper-focus dynamic. And I get that, but I don't think that people truly understand the hyper-focus. It's not something that can be turned off and on. I had somebody, a professional a while back, this was years ago, tell me that I didn't understand ADHD at all, and that they were diagnosing it, and most of the ADHD clients could hyper-focus on video games. And I tried to explain to them, that's not the hyper-focus that we're talking about. The hyper-focus is actually a really inconvenient symptom of ADHD. And in fact, you don't turn it on. It doesn't just happen for the things that you like. In fact, you might become almost obsessed and hyper-focused on something that you don't like, and it's really inconvenient. It's the wrong time, the wrong place, and you just can't snap your mind out of it for whatever reason. And so even this whole hyper-focus symptom, most people can identify with that. We get hyper-focused on something that we enjoy, or we get hyper-focused because we're just kind of stuck in a moment. We really want to figure something out, or sometimes we can get hyper-focused because we want to avoid something else subconsciously. But the behaviors must be intense, they must be frequent, and they must be enough to cause a significant functioning issue or impairment in daily life. This isn't, it gets in the way sometimes. It's significant. The bad effects in your life are something that you've tried over and over again to address. In fact, I've talked to people with ADHD who cannot play video games because focusing on the video games is something they really want to do, and it would give them a friend group to be a part of, and they just can't get themselves to do it. So it's really this pervasive, it's affecting every area of your life. That's how a professional who truly knows what they're talking about assesses, is this ADHD, or is this a habit or behavioral issue that can be changed with some light pattern changes in somebody's life. If it happens occasionally, look, it's not the diagnosis. Adults and children can be diagnosed with ADHD, to be sure. By the time it's adulthood, the ADHD percentage used to drop off significantly. And so we're seeing these interesting statistics. I've seen that as much as 5% of the children, including adults, have ADHD. I've seen as much as 20% in some articles that are definitely not based in any study that is reputable. But ADHD is real, but it is overdiagnosed. The other piece is ADHD is not a learning disability. I'm not saying that somebody with a learning disability can't have ADHD as well, but ADHD is not a learning disability, yet for some people, parents, teachers, professionals are treating it as though it is a learning disability. And this becomes an issue, number one, because you're not going to get the help that you need if you treat it like a learning disability. Number two, you might not have the inclination to hold yourself or to hold a loved one with ADHD accountable if you think of it as though it is a learning disability. I'm not saying it doesn't affect learning, but it is different than a learning disability. When you think of ADHD, I want you to think of it as a mental health disorder that is pervasive. It affects concentration and hyperactivity, and those dynamics in the diagnosis can affect other areas of the person's life. When I have these discussions with people, The list of symptoms is something that most people can identify with. The impulsiveness, the disorganization, the can't manage my time, the problem focusing on a task for a significant enough time to get it done, the trouble multitasking. I know that everybody should try to stop multitasking, but there's a difference between I struggle multitasking and what happens with somebody with ADHD. It's not just that they struggle multitasking, it's like a whirlwind of things that get started and never finished and forgotten about. Again, that's something that many people do. That is a human condition, to start a task, not finish it, and then move on to another task because you were reminded of that task. But the pervasiveness of it is something that needs to be assessed in order to give the diagnosis. Excessive activity or restlessness. You have somebody who doesn't pay attention but crashes. It's much different than somebody who has struggles to pay attention and they never even have that crashing point. And that's one thing I talk to parents about is you might have a child who has other issues going on or just a personality that makes it difficult for them to pay attention. But what's it like when they're exhausted? And what is it like when you see them even sleeping? Oh man, a lot of parents who come to me with children who are appropriately diagnosed with ADHD will describe that their little bodies when they were really young never, ever stopped. Not they were really hyperactive during the play moments and everything, but we're talking even, it was like until they were a dead sleep, they were just moving and grooving. And so that's always an interesting discussion to have about the past in terms of somebody who's been diagnosed with ADHD. The poor planning, the low frustration tolerance, mood swings, problems following through with tasks, even when somebody is helping them. The ability to cope with stress changes for them. Not just, I can't cope with stress, but their attempts to deal with stress becomes something that looks different. Those are just some of the main symptoms. I think that a lot of people can identify with like the fidgeting and the restlessness, because again, especially in this day and age, it's one of those symptoms that it's societal. It's a symptom of the ages that we live in. But fidgeting is such a thing. If you go on Amazon and put in fidget toy, there are millions of different types and versions of fidget toys. I mean, that's become what I would guess is like $1 billion industry, is creating fidget toys. Another one that is really interesting is the excessive talking. And it's not just this arrogant, I cut people off and I want to talk. People in general, when you're in a conversation, will talk over each other. And I call it this kind of innocent talking over. When you watch somebody who truly has ADHD, they don't just talk a lot. There's this bouncing around in their talking. And it's like this innocent, I got to get it out kind of narrative. When you allow it to happen, and I've allowed it to happen before, it's funny because when I have somebody who's truly ADHD, even if they come in kind of shy and not wanting to be at therapy, I can get them going. I can get their kind of venting, this expulsion of talking, excessive talking out. And it's not always on, but there's a big difference between that and a truly ADHD person and somebody who just struggles with talking too much or not paying attention. When I think about ADHD in school, the teens or the little ones that we work with, and trying to help them function better. What's interesting is coaches, a lot of it has to do with just using tactics that would work for the average person and trying to get the ADHD person to do it. Very recently, I had somebody who left work with me to go to one of these ADHD coaches. That coach got paid way more than I do an hour. And they loved it for a while, and then they came back, and this has happened many times. And then they came back to me and said, well, everything that I was doing lasted for about 2 months. Usually it's like 2 weeks. And now I feel like I'm in the same spot that I was in. Schedules And routines are important for ADHD, but you've got to accept the boundaries, I guess, with which you can work. And you've got to accept some things about yourself so that you can create routines that are actually going to work for you. One of the things that I think is funny is telling somebody with ADHD to organize a folder and to have a calendar that they write their stuff on. Coaches will tell ADHD people to do the very things that they struggle most with doing that actually trigger their anger and their frustration within themselves. Sometimes you've got to accept your tendencies as you work on your tendencies and as you try to grow and become more organized and become somebody who can pay attention better. But you've got to do it within the realm of what is possible now. You can't do it like everybody else. And look, this disorder is something that you can overcome. You can get very good grades. I went from getting really struggling in school to getting really good grades in college. And when I look at my freshman year, where I actually failed a history of rock class, and then I got A's and B's in some of the most difficult psychology classes, ADHD is not an academic death sentence. It's just you've got to know yourself. You got to understand what is going to work, what's not going to work. And you've got to be committed to doing the work to train yourself, train your brain to do better, so to speak. And so one of the things that I think people do is they either get diagnosed with or they diagnose themselves with ADHD, and then it becomes this excuse to not be able to perform. Well, I can't do that because I have ADHD. No. You might have to figure out a few odds and ends and workarounds and navigate a little bit differently, not drastically different. You might have to navigate differently, but it is no excuse in terms of success, both academically and in life. One thing that I want anybody who, whether it's a parent or a teen or a child that's listening to this, one message I want you to hear from me is, if you are truly ADHD, it is not an excuse. It's not an excuse for anything. And parents, you can still set healthy, normal boundaries with your child who has ADHD. It is something where you might have to work harder in certain areas of life in order to be successful in certain ways. But it is not an excuse. Again, I can't say that enough. It is not an excuse for not succeeding in any way, shape, or form. I watch all these, the algorithm of the Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and all that is really interesting. And the algorithm will spit out some of these anecdotal professions on ADHD. And it'll be somebody who makes these huge claims of ADHD and about their behavior. And often these videos, number one, exaggerate or kind of twist the symptoms. And then what I've noticed is there's this undercurrent to these videos of, hey, see, I'm a victim of this. Don't hold this against me, while they are putting it on display. And again, I want teachers, parents, professionals to be kind, to be graceful if you know somebody has ADHD. But I don't want us to enable anybody with ADHD. And I saw one particular video recently. It was a gal who was pierced up, had tattoos, and the message was, if you're going to love me, you have to understand that I can't do this, this, and this, and here's how I'm going to behave. And the behaviors were nothing that were pleasant or good. They were these really unhealthy behaviors that had to do with impulsivity. If the video helps somebody have grace for somebody with ADHD, I'm stoked. But at the end of the day, the video was one big excuse for, here's why I made these really very terrible choices in my life, and I can't be held accountable. If you have ADHD, it's something you're going to have to contend with, but you can be held accountable. And your parents, your teachers, your bosses should have the same boundaries and expectations of you as they have with anybody. In schools, hey, there's a 504 plan. Let's absolutely sit you up front. Let's absolutely give you some more time to complete things. Let's absolutely check in with you more. and maybe have more accountability points for you. But you can and should be expected to perform and follow through, etc., even if it's more difficult for you than somebody without ADHD. So again, I hope that nobody listening to this thinks that I am minimizing ADHD. I was diagnosed with it at a very young age. And it's one of those things where as soon as I forget that I have that diagnosis, somebody in my life will notice something, one of my tendencies, and likes to remind me of it. And I take it lighthearted and I'm fine with it. And I've accepted it. And I've done the work to not just get through college, but to get a master's degree and a license and to help others who have ADHD. But I'm not minimizing this diagnosis by any means, but I think that the pendulum, like many things right now, has swung a little too far to the right, and we're making it sometimes something that it's not. In other words, something that is so severe that you can't overcome. And then we are also making it so that too many people identify with it and are diagnosing themselves with it. And then we as professionals are overdiagnosing it. When it comes to getting organized, for instance, with the average person, you get organized and you every week put tabs in your folders or have various ways of organization that the society as a whole has kind of accepted. And if you've got ADHD, stop trying to do that stuff. I know that I need piles. I need piles in various places, and I need to just be able to shove that stuff in a container. And so at my house, I don't even have normal files. I have these plastic bin things, and I shove that paper, and I will every once in a while have somebody actually help me kind of go through it to get it organized so it doesn't get too out of hand. I have a very clean and organized house, and I have made accommodations for myself. And I can remember every year being told to get these specific tabs and binders and everything else. And what finally worked in college was I knew I was going to shove everything in my backpack. So I needed to make it very easy to shove it in my backpack, but have it somewhat organized. And then as technology got better, I realized that I am not only going to shove things in one spot, but I am also going to have to accept the fact that my stuff is going to be crumpled up. And when I need to find it, I'm going to have to kind of go searching a little bit and go through it. So if I accept that, then I'm going to find ways to shove it in my backpack in a more organized way, rather than trying to pretend like I'm ever going to unsnap a 3-ring binder, put 3 whole folders, and nicely, cleanly organize my papers. That was never going to happen. I spent years and years trying to do it. And now I realize that that was foolish. It was a waste of time. And till this day, I do not buy 3-ring binders. When it comes to like organization in my house, I have to get rid of things on a regular basis. I cannot have too many things. I've got to keep it simple. I've got to keep the organizing systems, so to speak, in my house simple. I have a very nice, neat home, but I've got to be able to shove things into bins and then have a place to put those bins instead of, again, this meticulous way of organizing things. I remember one specific thing that ended up changing my life academically. And that's I finally accepted that if I take notes, I'm not going to do well in a class. And I know that sounds wild. And so I had to advocate for myself. I went to all of my teachers and I said, look, when I take notes, I can't pay attention. I have been diagnosed with ADHD. I'm not asking for any accommodations other than this. Can I ask somebody else for the notes or ask you for your notes? And in my upper level division classes for college, that's when I started going to the teachers. And I think that's really important, is accepting what you can do, accepting where you need to put more work in, and then asking for help in reasonable ways. No teacher said, no, you got to take your own notes. And here's why. I went in, I sat myself in front of the class, and I participated always. So there are 2 things that changed. Number 1, I stopped taking notes. Number 2, I started participating in class more. I talked, I asked questions. I would make up questions that I already knew the answer to just because I knew I needed to participate. And then I did something else. I began to form study groups. And I wouldn't go to these study groups prepared. I would go in knowing that I'm going to last minute look stuff up, start the conversation, and I would take control over these study groups so that I was doing a lot of talking, because that talking and that working things out and the raising my hand and the asking questions and getting it answered, all of that embedded the information I needed into my brain. What never worked for me was taking notes, reading notes, and then reading a textbook from front to cover. Another way that I navigated through college was I finally accepted that if I read an entire page, I'm going to go nuts. I hate it. And what I began to do was look for patterns in the text so that I knew what to read. And I would jump around. Look, I was going to jump around anyways because that was a symptom. So I used that to my advantage. Till this day, I have not read a textbook the way that you're supposed to read a textbook. I read them. I have to read them. Now, we've got some really cool technology now. I can look at words while listening to words, and I use those apps because I want to keep up on my training, and I want to make sure that I'm a therapist who is keeping my education going. And so I read, I listen, I pop around, I read a little bit more. There's all these little navigational quirks that somebody with ADHD should be paying attention to. And what it's called is it's creating your ADHD profile. Something that everybody should be doing is, number one, going through the symptoms and asking themselves, how prevalent, how big is this symptom for me? And then, what have I tried? What works? What hasn't worked? As over time, you kind of create this profile and write it down, record it, do something so that you can come back to it. But as you figure out the nuances of what works and what doesn't work for you, you'll find that your brain begins to change, that you are able to overcome things that you didn't ever think that you would overcome. And it's not just academically. It has to do with your impulsivity at home. It has to do with relational issues. We get so focused on the academic issue of ADHD, but remember, it is symptoms that are throughout your entire life, all the pillars of your life, all the relationships. As you build this profile, don't just do, oh yeah, I can concentrate here or not here, and here's how I can do better academically. It's pay attention to some of the things going on in your relationships. Pay attention to some of the patterns that you see that are pervasive that you want to work on. And here's the thing, if you don't make it tangible by writing it down or voicing it into a recorder or talking to people about it, what happens is it's just going to be a fleeting thought and you will never make progress. If you truly have ADHD, you will need to take accountability. You will have to stop using it as an excuse. And it'll be something that you probably think about on a daily basis, but it doesn't have to be something that continues to pervasively ruin or get in the way of your life. Man, I could talk about this forever. I barely touched the surface on ADHD and some of the messages that I want to get out there. We are in the middle of building a program specifically for clients struggling with ADHD that we hope will help them do things like build their profile and come up with a treatment plan, so to speak, that they can take off into their own life when they're not working with a therapist. And I think that understanding this diagnosis, understanding the societal things going on in terms of overdiagnosing, understanding the medication aspects to this, which I didn't even touch today, are really important because this diagnosis is being talked about maybe more than any other diagnosis out there, especially if you have family members who are struggling academically. So hopefully that helps, and we'll catch you again on the next episode.
The Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast is an Inspired Resolutions production, hosted by Brandon Jaffe. Edited and mixed by Natalie Atkinson. Music by Natalie and Sean Atkinson. Inspired Resolutions Counseling is based in Yorba Linda, California. Whether you're interested in joining our group, seeking therapy services, or exploring more of our resources, you can find us on our website, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at Inspired Resolutions Counseling.